Hello, my name is Ivan Taylor, and I'd like to show you today some work I'm doing in modeling. Um, I have a very boring title of three models and four applications. I hope my presentation isn't as boring as the title. First, most these models are mostly in system dynamics, but I also have an agent-based model, and I'll discuss the three models and their applications. System dynamics, I describe to my students as a highly interconnected system of first order differential equations with boundary conditions solved using numerical methods. And that's a big mouthful, but it really just means that we're using calculus. And calculus can help us model behavior over time. So, what I like to tell my clients is that system dynamics tells you where you are, how you got there, and where you're headed if nothing changes. And then, if you don't like where you're headed, you can look at the system and try to find ways to change the system to get to a better future. Agent-based models, on the other hand, at their simplest level, are basically they consist of a system of agents and the relationships between them. The comparing system dynamics and agent-based model, as you probably know, system dynamics uses continuous variables, where agent-based models use discrete agents. System dynamics updates the values of all the variables in each time step, and agent-based models updates the states of each agent each time step, each unit of time. And system dynamics is generally deterministic, whereas agent-based is models are generally probabilistic. Now, these sound like a lot of differences, but really, I think there's a lot of similarities too. So, for example, if the number of agents is large enough, system dynamics can be a fairly good approximation to an agent-based result. And if you're doing probabilistic modeling, you often have to do multiple replications and then take some averages. And when you take averages, you lose that discreteness. And so basically, the nature of the discreteness is not as strong as it might seem. So the three models I'm going to consider are Schelling's classic agent-based model of emergent racial segregation. And then I want to contrast this with a model that I built on bias in the hiring and promoting processes of an organization. And then I'll present for the natural systems people a predator-prey model that I think I reasonably applied to the situation of civil unrest. So let's begin with Schelling's model. Now, many of you, most of you probably have already seen Schelling's model, but it's available on many agent-based modeling websites. I looked at a number of those websites, and I found them to be unsatisfactory for my purposes. So I'm going to use this version of Schelling's model that I wrote in Excel. And the idea here is, you may know, is you have a neighborhood of houses, and you have houses from white households. And so let's say 60% of the houses are white households. And then you have a certain percent of black households. Let's say 30% are black households. And so then you start with a random configuration of households where the black squares represent black households, the white squares represent white households, and the green squares represent vacant houses that people can move into. And then you specify some in-group preferences. So the preferences don't have to be that strong to create the emergent behavior. So I'm going to put in a 40% preference that basically a white household would like 40% of their neighbors to be white, not a majority, just 40%. And the black neighbors, black men, households would like to have 40% of their neighbors be black. So with those in-group preferences, I look at the system here from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right-hand corner, and I can consider every household and determine whether they're happy where they are, and if they're not happy, they will move to one of the random green square in a random to one of the green squares. So let's go through this year by year. So here's the moves. There's 494 moves in the first year, and you can start to see the segregation forming already. And then in the second year, there's 445 moves, and then 388, and so on, 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 and so on. And then we get to a point where basically we won't see much change. So this shows the emergent behavior that I think this little workshop wants to talk about. However, I think that Schelling's work, although it was the first, one of the very first agent-based models developed, and one of the very first models to show emergent behavior. However, I find it very pessimistic. The idea that these small in-group preferences lead to this emergent behavior of segregated neighborhoods, in my mind, it seems very pessimistic, and it makes it seem like segregation is a natural process that can't be avoided, and it doesn't give me a real feeling of policies that could change the system to be better, a better situation. So now I want to look at a model that I built um, for looking at bias in the hiring and promoting processes in an organization. So uh, I start this model with a description of the community that the organization is in. And I describe this community as by its size and the percent of the population in that community that is from a minority. And the goal is to achieve a representativeness of that minority in the organization. So we want to have a model organization that represents the diversity of the community. So we define the community, then we define the qualifications and interests the of the workers of the applicants who might want to work for the company. So they have to be qualified, and they have to have an interest in working for the company. And then we define the company in terms of the number of managers and the number of workers. We have a very simplified organizational structure of just managers and workers. And we have a very simplified community of just majority and minority members. So then we define some parameters around the positions in the company. And then we get into the bias in the hiring and the bias in the promoting processes. So I set this up to run with basically a neutral, no bias situation. So there's no bias in the system. And if I run the model, you'll see that on the y-axis, I have the level of diversity, and on the x-axis, I have time. And you can see that over time, the level of diversity is increasing. And this is sort of the opposite of the Schelling result. So basically, this model starts where Schelling left off and basically shows that with the natural processes of retirement and unbiased hiring processes, the diversity levels will improve over time and basically resolve the problems of segregation. Now I'm going to look at you're improving things, no doubt, but notice that this is a 20-year period. And the question becomes, are we willing to wait 20 years for the situation to improve? Basically a generation. Are we willing to wait a generation for the situation to improve, or do we need it to improve faster than that? So then we can look at some policies that might change the rate of change the rate of improvement. So for example, let's first, just for the case of study, let's look at a systemic bias against the minority in the hiring process. So this is just comparison purposes. And we can see that if there is systemic bias against the minority in the hiring process, this leads to stagnation in the diversity level. And now we'll consider systemic bias towards the minority in the hiring process. And in this case, we see a much more rapid increase in the diversity levels of the organization. So that's a good thing, I think. And now let's return the systemic systemic bias to neutral, and let's look at another type of bias. So we're going to look at individual internalized bias. So this is the idea that applicants may be discouraged or encouraged to apply for a job in this company based on their perception of their ability to succeed in their application, get a job in the company. And this perception could be based on the current level of diversity in the organization. And the idea of internalized bias is important because you can't hire people who don't apply. And this is the idea that these people are considering whether to apply or not. So let's consider a situation where there is internalized bias, which is in favor of the minority, encouraging them to apply. So then we get this result that shows that this internalized bias improves the situation over the no bias case, but it doesn't improve the situation as much as systemic bias towards the minority. And now finally, let's look at systemic internalized bias, against the minority, discouraging them from applying. And you can see here from this run that the internalized bias against the minority is much less impact on the diversity level than the no bias case. However, there is still some improvement over time, and this internalized bias is much less of a problem than systemic bias. So I think personally that this is a much more optimistic rendition of the problem than Schelling's segregation model. It's showing that things are improving over time, and naturally over time, if things are done properly. Also, it leads me to the idea that policymakers or leaders could look at this dashboard of all the parameters in the model and try to play with the model to reach their diversity goals in the time they desire. And if they can find the parameter settings that reach their goals, they could then devise policies to affect the parameters in the way that they want. So this tool, I think, could be very useful for a leader in an organization to reach his diversity goals or her diversity goals. I'm going to change directions a little bit now, actually quite a bit, and I'm going to go back to my presentation, and I'm going to talk about a natural system, because this is a combined group with the natural systems. And I'm going to talk about a natural system that they're probably very familiar with, which is the predator-prey model. But I'm going to take this standard model and apply it to civil unrest. So As you know, I'm going to give an overview of the model, the predator-prey model, show how I applied it to the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis that it created. I was primarily interested in solving the refugee crisis because when I wrote this model and wrote this book chapter, the refugee crisis I felt was the biggest humanitarian crisis of our generation. So let's look at the predator-prey model. As you probably know, it starts with a small population of prey like rabbits and a small population of predators like foxes. And the prey reproduce rapidly, and the predator's population grows as it lives off the prey. And then when the prey dies out or they're eaten, the predator population dies out as the prey are decimated. And as I said, this is a system dynamics model which uses differential equations. Here are the equations. You can see they're interconnected, the x's and y's, x being the prey and y being the predators. And you can see the differential equations over time. And then you see that we have 4 parameters that have to be estimated to implement this model. So here we have the system dynamics view of the predator-prey model, and system dynamics uses these concepts of stocks in boxes. So we have a stock of a number of predators and a number of prey in these boxes, and then we have a predator birth rate that is dependent on the number of prey, and we have a prey death rate that's dependent on the number of predators. And that's how the model is connected in basically interconnections of the model. So when you estimate some parameters and run the model, you get this kind of result. So you can see the prey in red and the predators in blue, and you can see that the prey population increases quickly, and then the predator population follows suit, but a slightly delayed. The prey population dies off or is eaten, and then the predator population starts to die off. And then once the predator population gets low enough, the prey population can reestablish itself and increase again, and you get this kind of oscillating behavior over time. Now, I was applying this to civil unrest. And so my model is looking at protests by the civilians in a country, and these protests are assumed to be contagious. That is, that a protest in one city could lead people in other cities to also protest. So that's what I mean by sort of contagious protests. And then the regime sees these protests and responds with possibly violence to quell the protests. And then once the protests are quelled and the protests die out, then the regime can go back to a peaceful state with ceasefires. So here's the model that I developed, just basically the exact same model, except I replaced the predators with battles and the prey with protests. And you can see the contagion rate. You can see the regime response is based on the number of protests, and the protest quelling rate, quellings are based on the regime response of violence. And then eventually the protests die off and the battles start to die off as well, and you end up with a peaceful situation of ceasefires. Now, I applied this to the Syrian civil war, and I found data from 2011 to 2019, and the data is in blue. And I calibrated my model. Basically, I estimated the parameters of the model to try to mimic the data, and the model results are in red. So I took that data from 2011 to 2019, and I estimated the parameters, and then I used those parameters to project into the future. And so these are the results I got for protests and battles into the future. You can see that the protests died out pretty quickly, and the battles died out a lot slower. So even in 2019, there are still a number of battles ongoing, but it will continue to decrease, maybe slowly, until there's no battles anymore around 2035. Now, I don't believe this is actually a very accurate projection, because I believe that once the battles reach a low enough level, that ceasefires can be agreed to, and the battles will stop. Now, like I said, I was primarily interested in the refugee crisis that was created by the Syrian civil war, and this is my results for the refugees. So I had this idea of the refugees in the neighboring countries increasing over time and reaching a peak around now at around almost 7.5 million refugees, and then starting to decline in the future to get down to about a little under 5 million refugees in 2035. Now, the reason the refugees are declining is because the violence level is declining, and less people are fleeing the violence from Syria and going to neighboring countries as refugees. And also refugees are being accepted by third countries as immigrants, and therefore the population of refugees starts to decrease. Now, I don't believe this is a realistic projection either. I don't believe that having 5 million refugees from Syria in 2035 is a sustainable situation. And I don't believe that third countries will accept as many as 10 million Syrian refugees by 2035. So I'm going to look at some policy options that might be implemented to resolve some of these inaccuracies. So the first thing I'm going to look at is compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is a situation where third countries realize that they have accepted enough immigrants and they're not willing to accept more. They start turning off their immigration, the number of immigrants allowed into the country. And so I had thresholds. I looked at thresholds for that amount of refugees that were allowed in, and I estimated these graphs for 1 million refugees, 2 million, and 3 million refugees. You can see the three scenarios. And if it was 1 million refugees, we might have already reached that point, and basically no more refugees will be accepted. If it's 2 million or 3 million, there may be some refugees still being accepted, but you can see that the problem of this growing number of immigrants has been resolved. However, that creates another problem with the refugee population. The refugee population is no longer declining, but is now increasing because of compassion fatigue. And this shows that based on the birth rate and the lack of immigration, that the refugee population could grow to be up to 15 million people by 2040. So I looked at another scenario, another policy option, which might be possible to resolve the refugee crisis created by compassion fatigue. So I looked at repatriation. The idea here is that if the violence is reduced enough that peacekeepers could be deployed to enforce the ceasefires, and protect safe havens, it's possible that the Syrian refugees could be encouraged to go back to Syria. Now, this scenario here shows the level of violence necessary that that needs to be reduced to deploy the peacekeepers. So if the level of violence is high when the peacekeepers are deployed, you can start to repatriate those refugees earlier. So that's the graph showing the gray numbers with 4. And then there's another scenarios with different numbers of battles. And if the battles have to be very low to deploy the peacekeepers, then you end up with a late repatriation where more refugees have to be repatriated, and you end up with a lot of refugees still in third countries in 2040. I also looked at another scenario of repatriation, which involved basically looking at the rate of repatriation. So the United Nations High Commission on Refugees will not force refugees to repatriate. It will encourage them to volunteer to repatriate using incentives such as money that will be given to them to rebuild their houses and restart their businesses. And then the decision is left up to the refugees themselves. And they make this decision based on the quality of life in the refugee camps and the possibility that they will eventually become immigrants in third countries versus the quality of life if they return to Syria and restart their life with the money provided by the United Nations. So my conclusions are for this predator-prey model is that this model could be adapted to civil unrest and appears to work well, at least in the Syrian situation in the 2010s. It also can be used to look at the social dilemma and policies to resolve the refugee crisis. Now I'll go look at the whole presentation and I'll discuss some future work that I'd like to do with all these models. So in the Schelling model, I think that there's a possibility of applying the Schelling model to partisanship in the United States politics. So, maybe the Black households could be Republicans and the uh, white households could be Democrats, and you could see that this in-group preferences could lead to very strong levels of partisanship. Another thing I want to do with the bias model is I want to look at encouraging applications and getting leaders interested in looking at the model to try to help reach their diversity goals. And I want to convert the model to an agent-based model for small organizations where the continuous values in system dynamics don't make a lot of sense. Also, there's a new project I'm starting where I think the bias concepts from the bias model could be applied to women and minority entrepreneurs. That is, that there's systemic bias and there is self-bias or internalized bias that may apply to entrepreneurs in these groups to discourage them or not allow them to start their businesses or not allow them to be successful. And so we're looking at concepts like this to improve the success rate of these minority and women businesses. And finally, concerning the civil unrest model, I think it applies to other countries, and I'd like to apply to other countries and other protest movements. So, for example, would it apply to the Black Lives Matter protests? Then I want to investigate oscillation patterns and the possibility of evolutionary processes where the protesters learn from previous periods of time how to maybe reach their goals better in the next oscillation. Here's my references. I have two book chapters that have come out recently or are coming out. The first book chapter noted here is the bias model, which is coming out shortly. And then in a book called Advanced Systems Modeling and Simulation. And then I've already published a book chapter on the Syrian refugee crisis and the alternative futures to the Syrian civil war in a book that came out in 2020 called the Refugee Crisis Global Perspectives. These are my contact information if you have any questions or any interest in system dynamics, because I am interested in getting collaborators to work on my models, but also I'm interested in helping other people to use system dynamics to solve their problems, or at least develop policies that might be interesting to look at to resolve some issues. So if any of you would like to use system dynamics or learn more about system dynamics, feel free to contact me at these locations. and I'll open the floor to questions.